there's a theory that black people are indigenous to the Americas, right?
Right.
Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally.
Yeah.
That enslaved Africans were the original people of this land, that their indigenous classification was erased by law, records, and racial classification.
Right.
In our last video, we broke down how these theories formed, why so many people came to believe them. Today, we're examining the plain language rhetoric that keeps these claims circulating. Just because something is repeated often
doesn't make it true.
It doesn't. It just makes it familiar.
Right.
So this video does not dismiss the emotional weight behind the claims, you know, because they feel good. You know, I got to say that I also have been a person repeating those claims myself at one point. But after doing my research, you know, I came to believe otherwise.
I don't think I ever really believed them, but I definitely gave them consideration because I was like,
who didn't want to believe that?
I did say to myself, could this be true? Like, could we totally been hoodwinked?
We've been here already.
And we could have totally been hoodwinked.
I mean, we could have been, and that's what we examined in our last video, that there is a possibility that we were here. We just don't have, you know, the archaeological or the genealogical proof to back it up, the historical proof.
Or the DNA.
You know, the demographics and everything like that. We don't have that proof, but, you know, you know, we saw something where DNA only lasts so long. You know, we saw, you know, other claims that countered what our position was on that. But, you know, we're here. We wanted to just examine these arguments today. You know, I mean, honestly, in an age of soundbites, you know, ideas that feel right, they get repeated so often that they begin to sound like facts.
That's
you know
true.
what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
But, you know, repetition is not evidence. And when we're talking about identity and history, right, and ancestry,
right,
you know, we have a responsibility to ground our claims in fact, so we don't end up misleading our own people.
Right. Now, before critiquing this position, it's important that we clarify our understanding of the opposing argument, or better yet, how this rhetoric comes into play, right?
Right.
And like we were saying, is that this is not to ridicule or to convince or anything. This is just a thought exercise, for lack of a better word, to make people to think about it, because we don't think that anybody's confused or ignorant or lack intellect, you know, but we want people to just give real thought analysis to these theories, to these theories, right? And so the argument is that, once again, we're restating this, the argument is that racial classification, slavery, and bureaucratic record keeping distorted identity so severely that Black Indigenous classification was erased from official history. And that claim does deserve serious consideration.
Absolutely.
And not to be just dismissed, because those things did happen to us. But does that prove that we are an indigenous race of people in America?
We're here to scrutinize that argument today.
Right. And we're going to break it down for you.
We're going to break it down. So, you know, one of the most common strategies used to support the claim is selective quoting of Black historical figures. Short phrases like, we were here first, or, you know, we're the original people.
Right.
You know, that were pulled from speeches and presented, you know, they're literally presented as literal evidence.
Right.
Literal historical evidence.
Right. And like James Baldwin, you know.
Right. He's one of them. You know, he uses an analogy for being oppressed.
What this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy his sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared, and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic. And in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white. And since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you.
And a lot of people take this out of context to mean that he is speaking about being a literal Indian. But when looking at this statement in its entirety, it's clear that he's not. That's not what he's saying.
Clear, right. And then I found something that was actually curious online. I read a lot of poetry, so I had come across something online of talking about Langston Hughes, and where one of these theorists, and when I say theorists, I'm talking about the people who are promoting that Black people were indigenous to the Americas, had quoted the first line of this Langston Hughes poem that's titled Lament for Dark Peoples, right?
Yeah.
And the first line reads, "I was a red man one time, but the white man came. I was a black man too." And the theory was that some people are actually using this as evidence and proof that the black man was reclassified as, or the indigenous man who was the red man, who they believe was actually the black man,
right,
was reclassified to become black.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
and that's how our status changed. But I'm gonna read the rest of this poem for you. And the poem goes, "But the white man came, they drove me out of the forest. They took me away from the jungles. I lost my trees. I lost my silver moons. Now they've caged me in the circus of civilization. Now I herd with the many, caged in the circus of civilization."
Yeah.
And when you read the rest of that poem, you clearly see that Hughes is not talking about us being indigenous. He's just simply talking about how both races have been equally destroyed by colonization. Their identity and their cultures have been wiped
lost their
out.
home.
Right. And he's definitely not referring to Black people having once been indigenous. And, the other thing that I find a little interesting too is there is a part of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream speech, where they use this all the time.
Take it all the way out of context.
And they say that this is proof that we were indigenous, because there's a segment of the speech where he talks about the Negro being in exile in their own land, right?
Right.
And let's take a look at this, and you guys can decide for yourselves.
Right. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition.
It's clear to see this is a metaphor that we're living in a social and political exile, not a literal exile.
Exactly.
And when he talks about exile in his own land, he's talking about us being citizens of America, not the original pre-colonial inhabitants.
Now, let me slow this down for a second right here. Some people are going to say, when we're talking about proving whether Black people were indigenous to the Americas or not, once again, we're not saying that it could not be true, because we just don't know.
Right.
But this right here, taking things out of context, it's not proof either. But
it's not proof.
But time and time again, people will say, This is the evidence. You see, our great thought leaders are saying it right here. We're
not trying to poke holes in what you believe in. We're just giving you our perspective.
Right, and it's something to think about. And the thing doesn't make sense. When you look at what these thought leaders actually said, does it make sense? And that reminds me of like the term Aboriginal.
Right. And the term Aboriginal has been used by many of the thought leaders.
Yes, absolutely.
But when they actually use the word Aboriginal, it's being used in an expansive, symbolic way. Speaking of Black people as the original people, first people, or foundational to humanity in its entirety, to counter white supremacy, not to make literal claims about pre-Columbian settlement in the Americas.
Right.
Or that Black people are indigenous to the Americas,
And to add to that, we are not disputing in any way that Black people were not, the foundational humans. We understand that archaeologically, scientifically, everything points to, civilization and human coming out of Africa. And we understand that. And we also are not disputing the fact that Africans could not have possibly traveled to the Americas and been trading and stuff.
Definitely not disputing that.
But just because they may have traveled to the Americas does not mean that they produced this large settlement while they were here, or that they were already here and and we're just living on this land. It doesn't prove it, right?
The key thing is for us to keep it all in context.
Exactly.
Because these thinkers consistently, like Cece said, they consistently identified Africa, as the ancestral homeland, while critiquing how American racial systems distort identity.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? That's what they were doing.
Exactly.
When we say so-called Negro, that's pointing out what we aren't, but it isn't telling us what we are. We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
Reducing their rhetoric to soundbites turns political philosophy into false evidence.
So this is another one right here where another key issue that I think is an issue. And in fact, Haas and I had a great conversation about this the other night. He always calls me the wordsmith. But I think he's more the wordsmith. But anyway, and that is the interchangeable use of the words native and indigenous. Yeah. Because when we think about the word native is to be born, literally means to be born in a place, right? So you can be a native New Yorker, for example. You can be, a native person from New England or whatever. But so in that sense of the word, that context of the word, Black Americans are unquestionably native to the United States in that sense, because we have generational roots. We have had a historical presence that's been here for hundreds of years. But when you take the word native and put it into the modern usage of the word native, it has become pretty much shorthand for Native American, which means that you have this intersection of birthplace, political identity, and basically,
collapsing them together.
Right. And pre-colonial nationhood, kind of collapse into one. And I just wanted to say this really quickly also, is that when you think about words, and how words are used, words change over time, and I often think about our daughter. We were having a conversation with her the other day where she was using the term microaggression. And even though that term was coined in the 1970s, when we were college students, at least I had not really heard of that word microaggression.
We knew how it felt, but we didn't have an etymology to describe how we were feeling.
Right, and now it's a common part of the language. And so I'm just saying this as an example, which I'm sure everybody understands this, as an example of how language can shift and change. And so when you think about the word native, if they are to use the word native to say you're born in a place and to say we are Africans or Black people are native to America, they are saying something that is truthful.
And
it is a truth.
Yeah.
But when you think about how the word native is actually used in today's political and social context, it's not true.
Indigenous, by contrast, it means something far more specific. A population that developed in a region over thousands of years prior to outside contact. It's like continuous cultural and genetic lineage tied to that land.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So, these two words, they're not interchangeable categories.
Right.
Sliding between them creates the illusion of proof where none exists.
Absolutely.
The emotional resonance of the word native is used to smuggle in the political and anthropological weight
exactly
of indigenous without meeting the requirements of that term.
Right. And because most Americans were never taught, or maybe not that we were never taught, but maybe because we just didn't, we just don't think about the meaning of how words shift and change. A lot of times when you use these words interchangeably, the language loses its precision, and everything that's built on it blurs. Right. And this blur is now intensified by how race is constructed in the United States, right? Mm-hmm. Because as we know, race is not constructed through ancestry, but through appearance, skin tone, hair texture, facial features, body shape. They become the basis of racial classification because, of course, visual sorting is a lot easier to enforce than someone's actual true ancestry or their genealogical truth, right?
Sure. I mean, this trained generations of Americans, as well as Black Americans, to read identity through the same lens colonizers used.
Exactly. So, yeah, we've all been contaminated, for lack of a better word, of race.
It's why claims like we have Indian features persist, even though genetic research consistently shows that while some African Americans do have indigenous ancestry, European admixture is far more widespread.
Right. So a lot of those features that we label as native are probably more likely the result of Black and white mixing under slavery. Right?
Absolutely.
Because enslaved people, were denied legal marriages. Heck, we didn't even have last names, and we sure did not have any way of keeping consistent family records because we weren't allowed to read or write for starters, right? And so then we had laws like Virginia 1662, I think it was 1662, 1662 statute that severed paternal recognition entirely by declaring that a child's status follows the mother, making ancestry pretty much irrelevant. So that means that once you had a Black mother, her child was automatically going to be
black.
Right? Yeah. And then that leads us to the one drop rule, which later, doubled down on this logic that basically allowed for mixed ancestry to exist biologically, but pretty much not socially. And any visible or documented African ancestry erased everything else by law. You, sir, are Black.
Yeah.
Right?
This is why even real indigenous ancestry often became harder to trace after emancipation. Black folks who actually had indigenous ancestry.
Right.
It was hard for them to trace unless they were actually on the Dawes rolls.
But, this is also something that happens with, even we still do it today, which is why you have someone like Tiger Woods who has Asian and Black ancestry. He's labeled as a Black man. But then you have someone like Keanu Reeves who has Asian and white ancestry. He's labeled as white.
Yeah.
We still follow those types.
Exactly. But the record keeping and being able to trace Black people being able to trace their heritage, got complicated. Especially when federal policy got deep. Right. It deepened. The Dawes rolls, it didn't simply record Native identity. They imposed U.S. racial logic onto indigenous nations, freezing identity into rigid categories like by blood and freedmen categories. Freedmen. Right. You know what I'm saying? These were categories that ignored lived kinship and culture.
And biology.
Right. And for Black citizens of Native nations, especially those guaranteed citizenship under the treaties of 1866, this amounted to bureaucratic erasure.
Absolutely.
And
then you have errors, omissions, and racial bias, are locked into these records, and they're passed down as if they're biological truths.
Right. Allowing later constitutions and blood quantum rules to expel Black citizens through paperwork rather than violence.
Right.
You know,
Right.
They found an easier way to get us out of the money market,
right,
so to say.
Right. And, this is where we have that emotionally charged language that comes in, so terms like paper genocide and eugenics, they appear frequently in these arguments that these theorists make. And for the most part, they do deserve careful handling because these are actual things that happen to us, right?
Absolutely. I mean, paper genocide refers to bureaucratic erasure, how records, classifications, and laws can strip people of recognition or continuity. Mm-hmm. For example, like I was saying, how the Dawes rolls, we just mentioned, forced native nations to identify as two groups, the freedmen and the blood, imbibed blood, basically erasing the native ancestry of many people who were black. And in this sense, paper genocide can explain loss of rights, but it cannot by itself establish original indigenous classification.
Right. And then, of course, you're talking about eugenics, which refers to the pseudoscientific racial hierarchies that were used to justify and control us. And they employed things like sterilization. And then, of course, the real reason behind it is to be able to exclude us on the context of blackness, which
right.
was considered to be a biological defect or a contaminant. Exactly. Yeah. Because the black gene is so dominant, it means that it's going to pretty much show up in your physical appearance for the most part, especially right. when you have those societies where back in the day where it was, mostly white
it's
and black.
It's a dominant gene.
Exactly. Exactly right. And this was used basically, eugenics that is, was used to destabilize black people identifying as native, especially in relation to land redistribution and federal recognition, Yeah. So when communal indigenous lands were targeted for allotment and sale, the state basically said, we're going to come up with a mechanism to decide who we could count as native so we can control these minorities who are now having all this land, right? Mm-hmm. And so identity became reduced to something that could be measured and pretty much fixed on paper. Mm-hmm. And so even people with minimal African ancestry, basically were labeled as less Indian. And in some cases I had even heard a couple of my native friends talk about where their actual native granddad, who was 100% Native American, I want to say he was Choctaw, and he was labeled as a black man because he was just a little browner and darker, and he had, a little wavier hair.
Sure.
And so...
both eugenics and paper genocide are real, and both caused immense harm.
Right.
But invoking them, does not automatically prove indigenous origin. And you can imagine when you invoke those words, eugenics and paper genocide, they bring up some really strong emotions within you.
Yeah.
Psychologically, these terms create moral urgency.
Yeah.
It encourages distrust of institutions when you apply those to them, and if you framed any type of skepticism to the argument that was being made, it's as if, if you didn't go along with it, it's as if you were participating in the oppression that was happening to us.
Right. Right.
And once these emotional conditions are set, the absence of evidence is reinterpreted as proof of cover-up.
Right. Right.
These arguments are persuasive, but
they're not logical. I guess the word is not to say they're not logical, but this goes back to also what we were talking about last night about how these theorists, they take something that is true and they mix it with something that is theory or something that's unproven. So it's not exactly.
They give you just a tad, right. Just a sprinkle of the truth, and then they'll put the rest in there, and then they just got you all discombobulated.
Right. Like how they take, the context of saying, oh, Dr. King knew we were indigenous because he said we were in exile in our own land. And he did say that. That is a true fact, but it was taken out of context, and now it's being applied to prove the theory. And it's not to say that it's illogical, and it's not to even say that they're wrong. It's just that it's unproven. And that's all we're saying. It's unproven.
It's unproven.
Right. And
you know, based on the different arguments that they're using to attach to it, sometimes it also feels like it doesn't really follow,
or like it's a cultish, because this is the techniques that cults use. They take something that is true and they mix it with something they either want to be true or something that they're trying to facilitate their thing with, and they put it in there. Now, I'm not saying these people are cults, but I'm just saying that's why it becomes fixed in our minds, because we're all vulnerable to that type of mental manipulation.
Absolutely. So we definitely encourage everyone to, do your own research.
Exactly.
Don't just follow along with even what we're saying.
Exactly.
If you have your own perspective, offer your own perspective. Put it in the comments below so that we can have a discourse. But going back to eugenics and the paper genocide, it's one thing for them to use those terms or use those things to remove us from being able to have land or being able to be classified. But that's a bureaucratic injustice. It doesn't necessarily rewrite the whole history of population of the United States, of the Americas.
Right.
It just because those terms are used, and those are real terms. Absolutely. To describe what we went through back then.
Right, exactly.
But all of that was after 1492. That was after colonization happened. So, it could have been, there's one side that argues, hey, we were the Native Americans that were here, and during slavery we were declassified. And then there's the other argument that, hey, we do find the genes or our DNA inside of Native Americans because there was a lot of mixing after colonization. So it's a toss bag. Right. It's a toss bag.
Right. And backing up a little bit, going back to the freedmen, I mean, it is true that many Black people, particularly the freedmen that were connected to these native nations, were displaced from land and citizenship. And, they weren't necessarily protected under these treaties, especially after they were expelled in the 70s. But, and racism, blood quantum laws, and the exclusionary enrollment practices are all very well documented. Exactly.
Yeah.
But conflating these issues, they may feel satisfying, but it weakens both the legal critique and the historical analysis of what truly happened and how it truly happened, right?
So that we can stand on who we are and not have to be confused. Well, I don't want to use confused, and not have to create or distort, what our true lineage or our true history is. I mean, we don't have to be the natives of America to have dignity. You know what I'm saying? We don't have to have all of that.
Right. And I mean, we're from Africa, at
the motherland.
And so we are
have pride in that.
We are descendants of a great people. And, and that's all I'm gonna say about that, and then I think that
what we're saying is, rejecting the claim that Black Americans are indigenous Americans, it's not a rejection of, like I said, our Black dignity. It's not a rejection of that. It's not a rejection of Black suffering
or trauma,
or Black belonging.
Right.
I'm not saying any of that. It's a refusal to replace one distortion with another.
Because at the end of the day, our history and what has happened to us has been distorted enough. And like we say, we're not saying that these things could not have happened, but we're just saying that for right now, from what all the evidence is, that it's unproven.
Right. History is not
unproven.
History is not decided by resonance, right?
Right.
It's decided by consistency, across archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and documented migration. Right. You know what I'm saying? And of course, like we said in our last video, it was not in the conquistadors' it wasn't to their benefit to record all of our history. You know, they were conquerors.
Right.
So, you know,
exactly.
a lot of stuff could have been left out, you know, on purpose.
And we acknowledge that. But what we're saying is that at the end of the day, that there is no solid proof from what we can tell that we are either indigenous to this land prior to contact, nor can we say that there was like a group of Africans that came and made a significant settlement. Could they have settled and had some people here? Probably. But when you think about the likelihood of these men sailing with women, I don't think with other black women and children, I don't think they would have brought their wives and children. I think it would have been, especially considering it was an unknown world. And then also when you consider that, you know, there's still patriarchy going on in all of these societies that, you know,
that was exploration now was occurring.
Right, it was exploration, right. So I don't...
Going off into the unknown.
Right, so if they did come here, they would have been mixed with whoever else was here, possibly.
Right.
That's what I think. But...
Well, guys... guys, we definitely like to invite you all to have a discourse with us on this topic. You know, we brought this topic to the forefront because in our comments, you know, we were getting all kind of different types of responses. Some that praised us for the research and content, and others that, you know, just totally disagreed or wanted to challenge us to a debate. And
But I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think that it's good that we're challenged. I think that that's wonderful, you know, especially because I had a beautiful conversation with one commenter where, you know, they was like, I do not agree with anything you said. And we went back and forth, but it was a really beautiful, enlightening conversation.